Hi, this is Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of the Contrarian. I'm delighted to welcome Mike Albertus. Mike is a professor at the University of Chicago and has written a fabulous new book explaining the connection between land and wealth and how land affects our political, economic, social life. Mike, welcome to the program. Congratulations on your book.
Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
So what is the connection between land, which we think of sort of as important in the Middle Ages, but don't really think of it as important in the industrial age, in the knowledge age, as a source of wealth and as having such importance to society?
Sure. I introduced this concept in the book that I call land power, which is the notion that land and the ownership of land confers its holders with different forms of social, economic, and political power. And because land is power, those who own it come to dominate power, whereas those who don't become dominated. And we see that pattern repeated again and again over the course of history, well past the Middle Ages, and far closer to the present, such that countries today are still engaged in reshuffling land as a means to reshuffling power. And even in our contemporary society in the United States, land comprises about 40% of the value of real estate. And in places where there's a housing crunch, like the Bay Area or New York City, that's somewhere close to 2/3 of the value of housing. So it's still very much present and important when we think about issues of power and wealth in our society.
Now, it used to be the case that the landowners were invested with political power and responsibility for those who are living on their land and below them. Explain how, in the modern sense, political power from land translates, and have we lost the second half of this, which is a sense of responsibility for others on the landowning, wealth-owning class?
Right. So if you think about the kind of classic picture of, large English estates or something like that, you had large landowners that had some domain, and maybe they had a number of tenants that were working for them within that domain and within that estate. And there was a degree of social deference for the landowner. There was, of course, economic power associated with estate ownership. You see that even on things like Downton Abbey, right? And that was itself kind of a social environment. And that didn't translate in the same way to the settlement of the United States, particularly the settlement in New England, where we had a much broader distribution of land ownership through smallholding farmers and the like. And there was certainly a responsibility then associated with land ownership. So things like property were intimately linked to the ability to vote and the right to vote. That being said, the expansion, the spread of how we think about private property today as individual, alienable and exclusive in its nature, oftentimes centers on the landowner and not on the broader society, right? And the implications for how one uses property on the broader society. So we see the consequences of that through things like, NIMBYism and zoning restrictions in our current American cities, as well as treatment of the environment and the like.
So right now in the United States, we have a housing crisis. Is it a housing crisis or is it a wealth crisis? In other words, have we so concentrated wealth in the top few that we've made housing really unaffordable for the masses of people who don't have accumulated land wealth?
Right. I think that's right, that it is something of a wealth crisis and inequality crisis, but also I think it's a land crisis. If you think about, again, zoning and zoning restrictions, which are a key problem in a lot of American cities in restricting the supply of housing. Today, there's a shortfall of around 4 million, 4.5 million units of housing within the United States. And that shortfall dates back to the aftermath of the Great Recession. And there's been a difficulty with actually building more supply of housing, which has generated a lot of problems in terms of access to housing and in terms of affordability. At the same time, since the end of the Great Recession, and especially since the pandemic, there's been the entrance into the housing market to a much greater degree of institutional investors, private equity, large-scale buyers that have helped to crowd out everyday people and made it much more difficult for first-time home buyers and for lower-income home buyers to access housing.
Okay. So talk to us a little bit about the kind of political system that arises when you have very big concentrations of wealth based upon land. Does that inevitably lead to a breakdown in democracy? Does that push us towards something that we don't normally think of as democracy, meaning we'll all count for one vote, we all have an equal say in society?
It certainly does tend towards an erosion of democracy and a slippage between that notion of one person, one vote, right? So, historically, there has been a close relationship between landholding concentration and authoritarianism. You can think about that in the interwar period, let's say in fascist, Germany or or in Spain or in Italy or the like. And there are many, many examples of this. But it's possible for democracy to survive landholding inequality, but it does put pressure on democracy in many ways. So, for example, we know that there's a relationship between home ownership and turnout and political participation in local politics. And so, to the extent that it's more difficult for people to access homes and the home ownership rate declines, as is currently happening over the last 5 or 10 years, we see that showing up in lower rates of turnout and participation in local elections. And so there is certainly a consequence to all of this, and it does impact the ability to express one's opinion and to share one's views on local issues and broader issues as well.
Is there also a generational effect? I come from California. In fact, I'm sitting in a city in California right now. And when they enacted Prop 13, which was a proposal that you couldn't reassess a house value year to year, or only a very small amount until you actually sold it, it allowed existing homeowners to accumulate vast amounts of wealth as their home appreciated, but priced others out of the market. Is land ownership inherently skewed towards older people, or is that just a phenomenon that was created in one state because of a strange decision on how they were going to allocate housing?
It is, I think, because of some of the broader dynamics skewed towards in favor of older generations, namely because of the supply issues. There's been, a growing supply issue now that dates back 15 years, and also there's been a real run up because of that in the price of housing. So first-time home buyers, younger generations, Gen Z and millennials are facing much higher housing costs than previous generations have faced, and both in absolute terms as well as relative to their paychecks, relative to their income. So it's very difficult right now for people to enter into the market. More generally, I think about 70% of people, Americans who were intending to buy a home last year in 2024, were not able to do so. And that was, the younger part of that group was more disproportionately affected.
If you had the proverbial magic wand and could enact some changes in property laws and housing that would both help eliminate these vast disparities and help our democracy, what would be a few of the things you'd want to pursue?
One of them would certainly be to try and incentivize, easing zoning restrictions and to try and make it easier to build and easier to build within city centers, easier to build in places that are accessible and close to public transportation and that are in high demand. So, there are tools that the federal government could use to incentivize cities, municipalities, counties, and the like to try and support an easing of zoning restrictions. So that's certainly one thing I think that is important to do. It's also possible, and this could be done at a very small scale, to use a very selective amount of public lands, particularly in the West, that are oftentimes even within cities that have grown over time and that have come to incorporate what were formerly outlying public lands, to use some of those for housing and to, with restrictions and regulations for affordability and density requirements and the like. That's been done, for example, within Las Vegas, and it's been fairly successful. It's been done in Colorado too, including under blue mayors and blue governors. And so that's a policy that could be used very selectively. So there are some practical solutions, I think, that are out there in order to address some of these issues. But at the end of the day, we really do need to build.
Well, Mike, it's a fascinating book, and it gets us to think about something that we thought was in the past, land owning. Land is a source of wealth, but it continues on to this day for better or worse. So thank you. Congratulations again on the success of the book. And we'll look forward to having you back. And maybe some politicians will take up your suggestion. After all, Republicans used to be in favor of less zoning as well. Maybe progressives and conservatives can find something to actually agree upon. Thanks so much. Good seeing you.